So we've examined a few different ways of defining the distinction between nature and nurture, or the distinction between innate and acquired traits. However, one option is to take a more sceptical stance. Many philosophers have denied that innateness is a substantial biological property. They would say that there really are no innate traits. Now, if we take this kind of view, there are two options. One option is to interpret talk of innateness in what I guess we might call a kind of deflationary way. It's fine to label some traits innate and some traits acquired, just as long as we keep in mind that this is of no biological significance, or at least we're not sort of ascribing a substantial property to these traits. We have to interpret the language in a different way. The other option is to argue that we should just stop talking about innateness. We should eliminate the term from scientific vocabulary in the same way that we no longer label people as being witches or demons, right? The very idea of witchcraft has just been eliminated from science. So let's consider the first option, the deflationary approach. This has been advocated by Richard Samuels in his article Nativism in Cognitive Science. And he treats the innate-acquired distinction as being a kind of boundary marker between disciplines. To say that a trait is innate is simply to say that the development of the trait does not fall within the purview of psychology. Innate traits are just those traits that develop in ways that cannot be described and explained in psychological or behavioural terms. So instead, we have to appeal to some other discipline, say developmental biology, in order to explain the development of the trait. Now, the first point to note about Samuels is that, as the title of his essay indicates, he focuses mainly on debates about innateness within cognitive science. And I think that maybe colours his interpretation of the debate. But certainly cognitive science is one area where the debate about innateness has been particularly fierce. So maybe it's not a big deal that he approaches it from that point of view. Anyway, Samuels suggests that however we define innateness, it must turn out that the arguments standardly given by nativists are at least relevant to establishing innateness claims. And that's not necessarily to say that the nativists are right, just that their standard arguments are relevant to what they claim to defend. A very famous argument we've seen is Chomsky's poverty of the stimulus argument, right, where Chomsky was advancing the idea that there is a language acquisition device that is innate. Samuels wants a definition of innateness that entails that this argument, the poverty of the stimulus argument, is at least relevant to whether the trait is innate or acquired. So in some ways he's adopting a kind of more conservative position, I guess. He doesn't want to sort of have to throw out a lot of current science or anything, so he doesn't want any major conceptual shifts or anything like that. And so that, I guess, explains why he's more attracted to this first option here of reinterpreting the talk of innateness. Right, so his view in a bit more detail. Samuel says that a trait is innate just in case it is a psychological primitive. Psychological primitives are traits that are mentioned in psychology or appealed to by psychological theories, but which cannot be explained using the standard resources of psychology. More precisely, Samuel says that some psychological structure S is primitive just in case, number one, S is posited by some correct scientific psychological theory, but, number two, there is no correct scientific psychological theory that explains the development of S. Samuels says, and I quote, "According to this definition, to say that a psychological structure S is primitive is to claim that, from the perspective of scientific psychology, S needs to be treated as one whose acquisition has no explanation." So it may be that the organism acquires S in the sense that it is born without S and then develops S later in life. But S is a psychological primitive when psychology cannot provide an explanation of how S develops. the explanation must be provided by some other theory. For example, some have suggested that certain abilities are acquired by a triggering process, like the case of a bird developing the whole bird song after hearing only part of it. Right, the bird is not born with the ability to perform the bird song, but it acquires only a very minor environmental input to trigger. So it just needs to hear a small section of the song, and that then triggers in the bird the development of the whole bird song. Now, this kind of triggering will require a non-psychological explanation. I mean, obviously the bird song isn't a product of learning or reasoning or whatever. In order to explain exactly how the bird song develops, we need to appeal to some theory other than psychology. So the bird song is a psychological primitive, or at least whatever causes its development will be a psychological primitive. So innate traits are psychological primitives. So think about Chomsky's language acquisition device. Obviously, this device itself is posited by a scientific psychological theory, but it's a psychological primitive because there is no further psychological explanation for the device. There is no psychological theory that explains how exactly we come to have this language acquisition device. And Samuels thinks that a key part of Chomsky's position is that there could be no such theory. There could be no psychological theory that explains how this device is acquired. In order to explain how the language acquisition device came to be, we're going to have to appeal to different sciences, to evolutionary theory, say. So, judgments of innateness serve a useful function because they guide and constrain psychological research. Innate traits are just those traits that are not acquired through any psychological process or mechanism, right? And by psychological process or mechanism, I mean just the processes and mechanisms that are studied and posited in psychology. If a trait is innate, you don't attempt to give a psychological explanation, you rather treat it as a fixed background condition. Every scientific theory has some things that it takes for granted, some things that it doesn't try to explain. And these are the foundational building blocks of the theory. The theory, you'll then appeal to other scientific theories in order to explain those building blocks. I guess unless you're dealing with something like fundamental physics, say, where you might just end up sort of hitting the end of the chain of explanation. But obviously, with psychology, you can then appeal to biology to explain the building blocks, and then in biology, the building blocks will usually be explained by chemistry and physics. So the debate about innateness is a debate about what can be taken for granted within psychology. And so you should be able to see why this is a kind of sceptical view of innateness, because on this view, when we say that a trait is innate, we're not actually saying anything about the world, right? We're not describing a property that organisms have, at least not directly. What we're directly saying something about is how our theories work. And of course, that's still important. So there may not be a clear distinction between innate and acquired traits as traits of organisms, but it's a useful distinction for directing and organising research. It helps to define the proper scope of psychological explanation. And it's quite clear from this point of view that, of course, there must be some traits that are innate. In the context of development, psychology is often concerned with learning, for example. But as Ned Block puts it, and Samuels quotes Ned Block as saying, "No organism can learn without a mechanism that accomplishes this learning. Hence, at least one learning mechanism must be innate, if only a mechanism for acquiring other learning mechanisms." And so the same is true for any other psychological mechanism. Some type of structure must already be in place as a result of biological processes that allows psychology to develop. So there will be some traits that are innate on this definition, at least some traits that we consider innate in the sense that they are not explained by psychology. So that's Samuels' view, but it does face some problems. First of all, okay, so Samuel says a trait is innate when there's no scientific psychological theory that explains how it arose. what is scientific psychology? Well, I mean, there's obviously a lot to say here. The distinction between science and non-science is a huge topic in philosophy of science, one which we won't go into today, but that's a really big debate. As for psychology, we might think, well, you can't really draw clear lines between different disciplines. Psychology will shade into biology, sociology, anthropology, philosophy, and so on. Scientific disciplines can't be neatly divided up in the way that Samuels seems to suggest. Now, in response to this issue, Samuels says that we don't actually need a strict distinction, right? It's enough that we have an intuitive grasp of what scientific psychology is. Maybe we could adopt a sort of institutional definition. So we might say, well, scientific psychology is just whatever is being done by the people who are classed as professional psychologists by our best research institutions. And that would then kind of give us an intuitive sense of the boundaries of scientific psychology. But I think this problem is a bit more serious. Samuels himself points out that whatever it is that counts as scientific psychology, however we define it, scientific psychology must ultimately be concerned with ontogenetic and not evolutionary theories about the acquisition of a trait. So ontogeny is to do with the development of the organism over its life, right? Whereas, of course, an evolutionary theory would be looking into the past at its ancestors. And so Samuel says that whatever it is that counts as scientific psychology, it can't include evolutionary theories. And the reason is pretty obvious. If evolutionary theories were counted as psychological theories, then we would have the consequence that any cognitive structure that could be explained as arising from evolutionary processes would not be innate, right? So any cognitive structure that was, for instance, an adaptation would not be innate, but that would be totally ridiculous. On this kind of view, the language acquisition device, for instance, would not be innate because, at least in principle, we should be able to use evolutionary theory to explain why humans developed a language acquisition device. I'm not sure if we have a clear theory of that, and actually, there's still some debate about whether there even is a language acquisition device. But at least in principle, that's the goal, right? If there is a language acquisition device, we want to be able to explain why it evolved. So if evolutionary theories were to count as psychological theories, then the language acquisition device would not be innate. But that, as I say, would be absurd. So evolutionary theories are therefore ruled out of the domain of scientific psychology. Now, the problem with this is that there's a whole field of evolutionary psychology where psychologists are trying to use evolutionary theory to explain the origin of cognitive traits. I guess Samuels would just have to say that evolutionary psychology isn't really psychology. Once you appeal to evolutionary theory, you're no longer engaged in psychology. But of course, if you want to take that line, then you can't just be dismissive of this question of, well, what counts as scientific psychology? After all, evolutionary psychologists are employed as psychologists by our best universities. So we would need a more substantive definition of what psychology is. But Samuels, as I say, does not provide that. Okay, another problem for Samuels is, I guess arguably he gets things backwards, right? So he suggests that innate traits are those that are psychological primitives, those that cannot be explained by psychological theory. But surely the question is, why? Why can these traits not be explained by psychology? Why are things such that some traits are investigated by biologists, while other traits are investigated by psychologists? Why is the world that way? And the natural response is, well, innateness is what explains this difference. Psychologists study the development of those traits that are not innate. Again, actually, this kind of view will run into problems with evolutionary psychology, but as we've seen, that's also a problem for Samuels. But the point here is just, look, the reason why the development of a trait has no explanation within psychology is because that trait is innate. And so the worry then is, well, as I say, Samuel sort of gets things backwards. Okay. Third, a major problem for Samuels is what he calls the overgeneralization problem. There are many traits produced by processes that are not psychological processes, but which we are not at all inclined to consider innate. For example, suppose you are in a car crash and suffer some sort of brain damage that causes you to have epileptic fits. Your epilepsy was not caused by a psychological mechanism. Psychologists don't provide theories of damage due to blunt force trauma. That would be a matter for biology or neurology or whatever. And so the epilepsy is a psychological primitive. Or consider infectious diseases. Samuels cites the disease Ross River fever, which apparently is spread by mosquitoes and causes severe hallucinations. Obviously, this disease and its spread are not psychological processes. Right? Those processes would be described by sciences like epidemiology, immunology, and so on. So that's a psychological primitive. Again, surely not innate. Now, in response to this, Samuels adds a normalcy condition to his definition of innateness. So what he says is innate now is he says that some trait T is innate just in case T is a psychological primitive and the organism would develop T in the normal course of events. Accidents that cause brain lesions and diseases caught from mosquitoes are not within the normal course of events. They are not part of normal development. Right? So a trait is innate just in case it's a psychological primitive, and that trait is part of normal development. And well, I mean there are some pretty serious problems here. I mean, what the hell is normal development? What is the normal course of events? Well, Samuels doesn't really tell us, and I think this is a pretty serious problem for his theory. I mean, let's say, for instance, that we have a population of animals, all of whose brains are damaged so as to produce epilepsy. This might occur in the context of lab testing, for instance. You know, that there might be a population of, say, lab rats that have their brains damaged in specific places that, you know, all of them have this damage inflicted upon them. So in that case, if we're just taking that population of lab animals, well, the brain damage would be part of the normal course of events. It happens to all of them. It would be normal. On the other hand, if you take the species as a whole, if you take all of this species of rats, well, it wouldn't be normal. It would be very rare. So, you know, we get a different judgment about whether the brain damage is innate depending on which population we count. And in fact, I mean, in general, it seems kind of ridiculous to say that the epilepsy is innate. I mean, even if you just consider the population of the lab rats, I mean, surely it's not innate. It seems kind of bizarre to say that the epilepsy would be innate. I mean, the epilepsy is a kind of paradigm example of a acquired trait, or so it would seem. A second problem with appealing to normal development is that many genetic diseases are rare. Huntington's disease, for instance, is fairly rare. And so surely, you know, the processes that cause this disease would not be part of normal development. If you take humans as a species, it's very unusual to get Huntington's disease. But Huntington's disease is innate, if anything is. Innate traits are not necessarily universal or near universal. So we need to state the normalcy condition in such a way that even rare genetic diseases count as normal. But it's really not clear at all how to do that. I mean, is it like, would we say that Huntington's disease develops in the normal course of events? I would have thought surely not. Again, the processes that cause Huntington's disease are not normal, and that's why it's rare. So, I mean, Samuels faces some difficulties, I think, and so we might be instead inclined to the other sceptical stance, eliminativism. Eliminativism claims that the distinction between innate and acquired traits is a feature of folk biology which has no place in sophisticated biological science. So it should be eliminated in favour of more precise, more scientific concepts. If you're at all familiar with philosophy of mind, this is basically the same idea as eliminative materialism. So in the context of philosophy of mind, eliminativists argue that the beliefs, desires, hopes, pains, and other concepts that are postulated by folk psychology, by our common sense understanding of psychology, these have no place in a proper scientific account of the mind, right? The concepts like belief and desire just give us a hopelessly wrong picture of how the mind works, so they should be eliminated. And in this context, eliminativists say the same about the innate acquired distinction. Folk biology, which is our kind of common sense understanding of biology, the layperson's understanding of biology, folk biology is hopelessly confused in many ways, and many of the concepts of folk biology, many of the concepts of folk biology should be eliminated. And so innateness is one of those concepts that just has to go. I mean, one interesting point about the debate about innateness is, people have been talking about innateness for hundreds, thousands really of years, right? The question of whether we have innate ideas or innate knowledge, that was the main point of contention between the empiricists like Locke and rationalists like Descartes. Indeed, you can trace this debate about innateness all the way back to Plato with his discussion of things like Meno's paradox. Now, the point is, these people, brilliant though they were for their times, they had no understanding of things like genetics, natural selection, adaptation, canalization, and so on. These are all modern concepts. So that would suggest that innateness, right, shouldn't be defined in terms of these modern concepts, right? Because if people like Locke and Descartes and Plato were talking about innateness, then innateness surely can't be defined in terms of a modern concept. But then you might say, well, why would you expect innateness to be a useful concept at all? Why would you expect that a concept that was in many ways a kind of product of our pre-scientific thinking would have any importance for modern biology? Philosophers that lived hundreds of years ago were wrong about almost everything. They didn't have even the most rudimentary understanding of biology or psychology or whatever, right? It was only in the mid-1800s when Darwin proposed the theory of natural selection, which for us, that's biology 101. So we can admire people like Plato and Locke and Hume and Leibniz and so on. We can admire them for what they achieved given the standards of their time, but they were all in a situation of overwhelming ignorance, right? Most of the concepts they had for understanding the world were just mistaken and confused and misleading, or so the eliminativist will suggest. The term innateness can mean a host of different things. Griffiths, Macquarie and Lindquist, in their article The Vernacular Concept of Innateness, so they try to study innateness as a folk concept, right? And so they try to figure out what is it that lay people, the average people, non-biologists, mean when they talk about innateness. And the basic method was to give lay people various stories about the development of birdsong and ask those people to judge whether the birdsong is innate. The details aren't really that important, but they basically found that judgments of innateness tend to be based on an evaluation of three properties. So first of all, there's fixity. So if a trait is fixed, that means the development of the trait is resistant to environmental perturbation. The trait is hard to change, basically. I think that fixity is basically the same idea as canalization, environmental canalization. Second, typicality. So this means that the trait is universal or near universal. The trait is part of what it is to be a member of that species. Every normal individual of the species bears the trait. Third, teleology. The trait is part of how the organism is meant to develop or supposed to develop. Development, in some sense, aims at the trait. If there's this traditional idea of development as being goal-directed, right? It's like it aims towards a certain form. Some organisms deviate for one reason or another, but it's always kind of aiming towards a certain form. So that's this idea of teleology, right? Development aims at the trait. And Griffiths, Macquarie and Lindquist say that when a trait scores higher on any of these properties, we will be more likely to judge that it's innate. So judgments of innateness kind of combine these three properties. Now, no proposed definition of innateness captures all these three properties. We have these concepts that are more precise, such as canalization. But the eliminativist says, look, it's misleading to say that innateness reduces, that innateness just is canalization, because canalization actually doesn't capture most of what is associated with innateness. Canalization does not capture the second or third of the properties that people consider when they make judgments about innateness. What we would need is a definition of innateness that captures all of these three properties. But that's probably not going to happen. First, because these are very different things. They're not coextensive. And it seems like they just can't be combined into a single coherent concept. And in any case, with respect to the third one, teleology, well, it's not clear that that's even biologically legitimate, right? I mean, there's a big debate that we don't really have time to explore here, but there are a host of different views about the proper role of teleology in biology. And I mean, you can look it up. Just look it up online, type in teleology in biology. There's probably a good article on Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy about it. But the point is, some philosophers and biologists think that we can kind of give a naturalistic definition of teleology. Some philosophers and biologists think that it's just junk, that there is no teleology in biological processes. It's a big debate. So I guess this sort of connects to my point earlier about how early philosophers were just wrong about most of biology. Insofar as teleology is part of the folk understanding of biology, it's that folk kind of view is mistaken or misleading. So anyway, the eliminativist concludes that the folk concept of innateness is just incoherent. Now, this doesn't immediately establish eliminativism, and that's because as science develops, the meanings of important terms will shift. So consider the definition of the word planet. Today, we define planet so as to require that all planets, the phrase is, clear the neighbourhood of their orbital zone. But this criterion of clearing the neighbourhood, that was added only in, I think it was the mid-2000s, when Pluto was demoted. The ancients had no understanding of the notion of clearing the neighbourhood. I guess it would probably not make much sense on the geocentric theory. So the point is, scientists often redefine concepts to make them more precise. And naturally, no precisification is going to capture all of our intuitions about a concept. I mean, it wouldn't be a precisification if it did, because you wouldn't be changing the concept at all, right? So we in science, you often try to make concepts more precise, and that's going to mean that you have to ignore some of the intuitions about a concept. So it's no objection to definitions of innateness that they fail to capture all of our intuitions about innateness. You know, the lay person's usage of a term should not be expected to be retained wholesale in the scientific usage. So when Ariew says that innateness is canalization, he's proposing a precisification of the concept of innateness. So that's one perspective we might have, but the eliminativist will say there are reasons to think that precisification is not going to be useful in this case. First of all, the concept of innateness is very deeply embedded in folk wisdom. And that means that when people talk about innateness, and people will often talk about it, this is going to encourage illicit inferences. People tend to assume, for instance, that if a trait is innate, then it cannot be changed. Or that it's an adaptation, or that it will be found universally among all normal members of the species, or whatever. So let's say we define innateness as canalization. Well, that's perfectly fine for professional biologists who understand canalization, and they understand that canalization does not entail that the trait is, say, an adaptation. But if we use the term innateness in this way, it's going to cause a lot of confusion when talking to people outside the field, because they'll just hear the word innate and then they'll engage in all of these inferences. They'll infer that, oh, it's an adaptation or it's universal among the species or whatever. In fact, this kind of thing has perhaps already happened with the concept of heritability, because as we saw, biologists define heritability in a very technical and somewhat counterintuitive way. Lay people don't understand the definition, and so there ends up being a lot of confusion about biological research. I mean, you can see that in any kind of media source that reports on some study of the heritability of a particular trait. They're usually confused about what heritability is. So the thought is, look, if you mean canalization, just say canalization, right? If you mean that a trait is universal, just say that it's universal, right? Don't bother introducing this misleading concept of innateness. And I suppose, it's generally, right, it's unclear what the point of precisification is. Ariew says that we should define innateness as canalization, but why, right? When we already have a perfectly adequate term for canalization, just say canalization. That's not confusing. That's very straightforward and precise. So, one problem with trying to precisify the concept of innateness is that you're going to encourage these illicit inferences. And a second point that you should bear in mind, that we should bear in mind about innateness, is that it's a term which has a lot of, emotional and political power. It's not purely academic. People will often debate about innate differences between the races or innate differences between the sexes. People will make claims about, the innateness of intelligence, say. These kinds of arguments are not purely scientific arguments, just in the sense that sometimes people will take them to have practical consequences, or they're just matters that people get quite emotionally worked up about. So that makes any potential miscommunication a much more serious issue. And in this respect, innateness is just not at all comparable to a term like planet in astronomy or force in physics. It doesn't really matter so much if lay people don't understand the term force in physics, because they don't generally. In everyday conversation and in politics and so on, you're not going to be talking about physical forces, but you might well be talking about, say, innate intelligence differences between the sexes, right? And that's really controversial. So this is why the eliminativist favours just eliminating the concept rather than trying to reform it. And the eliminativist will say, look, instead of dividing traits into two types, the innate and acquired, we just ask, for any particular trait, what resources are involved in its development. Don't worry about whether it's innate or acquired. Just look at its development, look at how it develops, and be precise and be scientific. So bear in mind, the eliminativist doesn't argue that there's anything wrong with poverty of the stimulus arguments and isolation experiments and so on. She just argues that we shouldn't interpret these things in terms of innateness. So that's the end of that, and that's the end of that particular little series. I hope you found that interesting. And well, that's all for now. I may continue this series actually with by looking at a more specific debate. So we've looked at this question of nature versus nurture in general. I was thinking maybe of looking at something like the sex versus gender debate, where that's often interpreted in terms of nature versus nurture. A lot of there's that standard idea that sex is a matter of your biology and gender is a matter of the social role or cultural role. If you've watched this series, hopefully you can see that there might be some problems with that standard use of the sex-gender distinction. So I was thinking of maybe looking at sex versus gender, and what sense can we make of that given the problems with the distinction between nature versus nurture. Okay, anyway, that's all for now, and thanks for watching.